I'm going to start with a quote by Robert Frost. There's two kinds of teachers, the kind that fill you so much with quail shot that you can't move, and the kind that just gives you a little prod behind and you jump to the skies. As young musicians, we may encounter many types of teachers, ranging from the traditional to a Suzuki advocate, and perhaps even some champions of Orff, Dalcroze, or Poldai for a lucky few. So what distinguishes a good teacher from a great one? At different career points, both of Frost's teacher types hold value. In my own teaching and composing, I find myself returning to a few basic principles that illustrate these ideas. First and foremost, I establish rules, identify parameters, ask questions, and maintain dedication. The most successful atmosphere for the student and the teacher exists when both parties are thinking, creating, and being stimulated by one another's artistic solutions. On my office door, I post the following reminder. Attributed to John Cage, this list was composed by artist and educator Sister Corita Kent and was created as part of a course she taught between 1967 and 68, eventually becoming the official rules at the LA Immaculate Heart Convent. The list touches on a number of themes and materials, including Bertrand Russell's 10 Commandments of Teaching, the importance of embracing uncertainty, the pivotal role of work ethic, the intricate osmosis between intuition and intellect, and the crucial habit of being fully awake to everything. Whether teaching a child or adults, the most fundamental goal for a musician is to find their artistic voice. After all, we make music to communicate something beyond words, something transcendental. For composers, creating a form, choosing an instrumentation, and devising an intention in tandem are critical. While modeling forms can be immensely important, beginners seem to excel when presented with an open palette, one that allows them to build the rules of their craft. Boundaries tend to limit the student, while options inspire. Every student is unique. I've found that encouraging open parameters is helpful. When a student has a hand in determining a form that reflects their creative intention, they're more prone to remain devoted to the inspiration. For most of us, teaching students how to ask questions and find solutions is more valuable than articulating history. If a sincere answer is to be discovered, the student must ask the question. For the teacher, this generally requires a lot of patience, listening, and learning. In creative fields, the answer is almost always found in the question. Once the student is invested in the process, then historicizing, theorizing, and analyzing will be natural consequences. For example, imagine a student who wants to illuminate the state of mind between consciousness and unconsciousness in composition, like being awakened from a dream. Rather than ask the student to mimic Debussy, which would be a pretty logical connection, I'd advocate for the student to first create their own form and instrumentation, requiring them to generate both the content and motivation for formal decision-making. Alongside these tasks, I would encourage several listening assignments by historically contrasting composers, with score if possible. This type of complementary approach strengthens both expressiveness and craft. Teaching demands a similar dedication to what's required when writing music and playing an instrument. For me, there's a natural benefit and balance to be struck between the musician and the teacher, as both to strengthen knowledge and encourage inquiry. That happens for both the teacher and the student alike. The most successful learning atmosphere exists when both parties are thinking, creating, and stimulated by one another's artistic solutions. When I consider the most memorable teaching moments, which are signposts to my own learning, I come up with a few consistent themes. Listen to and question everything. Hear what you compose and compose what you hear. Often, notation software is not the solution. Organize what you compose. Know where things and when things belong in certain places. Create a structure or a language for what you compose and hear. I tend to think that the best teachers operate in both ways that Frost describes, depending on where the student needs to go. Our job is to awaken curiosity, both in our students and within ourselves. I had my fair share of both teachers who filled me with quail shot and many more who nudged me gently into the sky. I visited Darmstadt as an impressionable graduate student during the summer of 1998. I've encountered many personalities who've shaped me as a composer, but one of the most distinct memories I had from this trip came from my interactions between two very different composers, Helmut Lachenmann and György Kurtág. Lachenmann vehemently told us, particularly the Americans, otherwise known as zombies, as he said, to forget everything we learned up to a point. He encouraged us to develop our own material independently of our teachers. He explained that we're part of the North American syndrome that potentially results in work without any real artistic provocation, just frustrating and boring. His musical outlook could be encapsulated in the following quote by Lachenmann. With conventional or unconventional sounds, the question is how to create a new, authentic musical situation. The problem isn't to search for new sounds, but a new way of listening, of perception. I don't know if there's any new sounds, but what we need are new contexts. On the other hand, Kurtág modeled this process through his practice of music making. Unlike Lachenmann, Kurtág would not meet his students for composition lessons, but instead opened his instrumental coaching sessions and rehearsals to students. Hearing Kurtág and his wife Marta perform Játékok at Darmstadt, I felt both emotionally and technically charged. Játékok consists of 8 volumes of miniature piano solo for 4-hand piano pieces, which aim to recapture the spirit of a child's play. The scores are frequently graphic, abstract, and include extensive descriptions of his notation. The pieces are inventive, playful, and even stoic at moments. Below the surface of the music, the layering of quotation and sense of quiet reminiscence serves to take the listener away from reality by creating something new and breathtakingly beautiful. Becoming acquainted with the score as well as recording that includes some Bach transcriptions interspersed between his pedagogical performance pieces has been both individually rewarding and collectively meaningful for me. These are the qualities I strive to achieve in my own work. The experience I had with the Kurtágs was definitely beyond words. Their methods derived from a strange combination of escapism, invention, and beauty, and they epitomize the motivation I have for music. I'm going to play just a short clip of one of these pieces from Játékok. I'm going to stop it there just in lieu of time. But gestural and poetic, Kurtág achieves this simply through play and pacing. With increasingly sophisticated composerly opportunities coming my way throughout graduate school, some of my peers thought I was out of my mind by continuing to teach children. I've recently come to understand that this is part of my passion, and that is any teaching at all levels helps keep my own childlike fascination with music in check, alongside the practical application of how to make that passion a reality. Since graduate school, I've shared Játékok with students of all levels, including children, university music majors, non-majors, as well as professional composers and performers. The consistent message of this piece, as outlined in Kurtág's foreword, is tackle bravely even the most difficult task without being afraid of making mistakes. We should try to create valid proportions, unity, and continuity out of the long and short values just for our own pleasure. Personally, I feel that I learned how to explain things to grown-ups by having to explain things to children. Likewise, children remind us about how to be genuine. Through performance and composition, Kurtag helped me understand this critical balance. Let's see. Going to the next. There we go. For example, this young composer on the right was not afraid to express the more abstract characteristics of movement. While the instrumentation is unclear, the dynamics, the contour, motion, and gesture all clearly articulate his feelings about what it might be like to climb a mountain. More mature students might approach this in a less connected way to the experience of mountain climbing, but this young composer approached the idea bravely. The map on the right was by a 9-year-old student, and it was about a circus experience. She was very savvy with notation, but she used this as a way to see the overall form. Again, intuition plays a role in inventiveness. For me, both Lackaman and Kurtag were onto something. Kurtag's kinesthetic relationship between playing and creating, alongside Lackaman's dedication to the authenticity of sound, resonate with me deeply. As a composer interested in collaboration, my teaching naturally encompasses a variety of musical skills, including composition, performance, theory, and history. I believe that without the merger of all these ingredients, the language of music is unbalanced and can potentially sway towards the overly intellectual or the creatively unchallenged. In music education, instructors tend to frequently separate these elements. However, as musicians, we draw on these various musical experiences in tandem, recognizing how each subject reinforces the other. To prepare students for the rigors of making music, I hope to encourage spontaneous thinking about these multiple aspects of music. Through the fusion of skill and creativity, the student and the teacher gain insight and can begin to discover that nothing is truly separate. Performance, composition technique, historical context, and theoretical understanding are all vital to cultivating a creative and thoughtful musician. After all, as artists, we learn through doing. Interacting with Kurtag and Lackaman during my formative period functioned as a refreshing contrast for models for me as an emerging composer. Initially, Kurtag was Frost's gentle nudge and Lackaman was my quail shot. And at the time, finding a complementary balance between both composers became immensely beneficial for me. As a consequence, I frequently turned to both for inspiration, craft, and teaching. As artists, young and old alike, we are lifelong learners, and above all, we aim to sincerely communicate. Teaching composition requires a balance between the student and the teacher, between the micro and the macro. The strategy includes the teacher's understanding of the creative process, the student's reflection on that process, and a design of individually tailored tasks for the student, a set of activities that are mutually agreed upon. Constant shifting between the big picture and small steps is critical. Writing music lends composers to strategies for invention. While teachers can guide students through the creative process, students can also help teachers reassess core aesthetic values. After all, how can one teach without be willing to learn at the same time? The roles of teacher and student become somewhat blurred in the process of making intuitive knowledge explicit. Similar roles between performers and composers exist, and they're fuzzy. Like most artists, composers are basically lifelong students. Therefore, the most effective composition teachers are first and foremost teachers and listeners. As a composer and a teacher, I encourage the development of preliminary expectations for a piece, ideally before any notes are composed. What is the composer's musical and non-musical intention? How does that relate to form, timbre, or any number of other parameters? And then, and only then, do we move into design. Graphs work really well for me at this stage. After notes begin to emerge, we review the initial intention. Has it changed? Should it change? Maybe the material is calling for a different architecture than originally planned. These are some examples from my own work, both abstract and more concrete. The creative process is, after all, one of give and take, a combination of having a vision of what is to come and an understanding of what has preceded. It's a kaleidoscopic process. Making music relevant is a theme for me. Like teaching, composing is less about the dogmatic and more about unifying parts. Each student piece is different. Beyond inspiration, there's a few key ingredients that I've found successful for myself and my students. Collaboration and communication, that is working together with musicians or others. This is a big part of my process. I'm not the type of composer to work in a secluded tower, nor do I encourage my students to do that. Intersection, that is, of ideas and disciplines. This piece is very different. While I sometimes draw on the same bit of toolkits, every piece is a new endeavor. Actualization, the result of any given project, but not necessarily the end, just to help to get to the next stage of the creative flow state. Through continuous creative flow is a state where I perform my best and action and awareness emerge. All of these things help me teach composition. I'm going to scroll ahead to this slide. We're going to fast forward, yes, back to the 50s, coming out of Darmstadt. Cage and Boulez met and began a series of letters back and forth. This graph appears in one letter. Mind and heart is a combination of structure, method, material, and form in varying order. Essentials I read from the diagram, which as you can guess is posted in my studio, is 1, balance the creative process with the technical process. 2, the order of the process is not important as much as that you establish a process. 3, remember the 3 phases of the entire process, that is to create, to perform, and to revise. Recently, I put together a graduate class in teaching composition, something that's lacking in most university programs. I'm sharing the syllabus with you, and I hope you'll find ideas both to help to teach and craft inspiration for your students. Thanks very much, and I'm open to questions at this point.
Thank you very much, Mara. Questions? Yes.
Can you hear us?
No.
Oh, yeah, you can just.
Somebody hold on. Okay, here I am. I have the stage. My question is, with working with young kids, a lot of times I find they might have like the one composition. Sometimes it's a little graph for piano, but how do you find? Is there a way to like get the next composition out of them? With little kids, it's really hard sometimes to engage them and see beyond like their instrument or like things that they already know. Thank you.
Yes, absolutely. Are you speaking specifically about piano students?
Yeah, I think piano students tend to write for piano because that's what they're used to. But let's say, what about piano students writing for different instruments like bassoon, violin?
Sure. Yeah, I think 2 things. One, getting the student to engage with the piano in perhaps a non-traditional way by making sound and exploring sound rather than just playing on the keys of the piano. That's one way that can really open up their imagination. But I also think that engaging them with other musicians is critical, whether that's joining studios with somebody that's teaching another instrument, perhaps a violin studio and a composition studio, pairing students up. That works, I think, with both kids and adults or university students really well, because then they have the opportunity to really learn the instrument through someone else. And then finally, I would just say, NAFME and MTNA have wonderful competitions, and I think these adjudications really help motivate kids to write more music.
Thank you.
Thank you. And I forgot to mention, those asking questions, please introduce yourselves before you ask your question. So please tell us who you are.
Sorry, yes, Avner Finberg, composer, violinist from Levine School of Music.
Thank you. Yes. Yeah, come up to the microphone. Thank you.
Hi, Catherine Balch, Yale School of Music. Thanks for your talk. I just was wondering, you said something early on in the presentation about like hearing music, and you said that MIDI realizations or something like that are usually not the solution. I was just wondering why. And also, I was wondering, like, I really like a lot of your examples and figures from other composers, but I noticed they're all like from 1950s, 60s, like sort of modernist dudes. And I was wondering if your students are kind of craving, other, like I've just been wondering if you have students that have sort of been seeking other sources or models of inspiration during your education, and maybe who some of those people are. Thank you so much.
Yeah, so to answer your second question, absolutely. This talk was really limited to some older examples just because that's what, a lot of my core philosophical foundation came from. But I do teach students of all levels, including university students. And so, I teach a post-1945 class for our graduate students, and we explore really everything up until very, very recent Pulitzer Prize winning composers. I do tend to go very directly to composers and what they say about their music. So if there's writings by a composer, I like to use that. There are some great resources in my composition pedagogy syllabus that I've shared. I can't list them all here, but they're there written out for you. Those would be some of the other models that I would be sharing that are much more contemporary. Part of the problem is that teaching composition hasn't really been codified, and so we're struggling very much to create that language, I think. And so for me, at least, a lot of that comes out of that sort of middle 50s, 60s period. But there certainly are many, many other examples. And I'm sorry, can you remind me of the first question?
It was much more practical. It was just, talking about the sort of...
the MIDI, that's right.
The MIDI thing, like you said, that's usually not a solution, and I was just wondering why.
I just think it can be really a deterrent. I'm not saying it's not a great tool. It can be, but I think we have to be really cautious as teachers when we use MIDI, because oftentimes students will then think that the instruments function like the MIDI, and that's not altogether true, as we know as musicians. So I just think there needs to be a real delicate balance, and some students rely too heavily on the MIDI, and that's when I would just say, let's write out old school notation, at least for this piece, so that we can re-engage with sort of the sounds themselves.
Thank you.
Yes, come on up to the podium. Thank you.
I just wanted to follow up on that question. I was wondering, so with my students, I know a lot of them use MIDI playback to hear their compositions, especially when it's not for a single instrument. Do you have any alternative recommendations for how they can hear their sound after it's being composed?
Go ahead.
Oh, and please tell us who you are.
Yes, sorry. My name is Radina Daseva, and I teach for the Mason Arts Academy in Virginia.
Great. Absolutely. I think that I guess I should correct what I said earlier. I don't think MIDI should not be used. I think it's a great tool, but I just think it needs to be used in tandem with actual sounds. And again, I think the partnership with different studios can be extremely beneficial. Like if you're running a private piano studio in composition, why not pair up with another musician, a performer, and get the students to work together so that they can learn really about how the instruments work. I think too often our students move on to writing large pieces or large ensemble pieces because it seems like the right thing to do, when in fact writing for just like individual instruments or small ensembles is a much more practical way for them to get the orchestrational skills that they need.
Or one more, since we started a little late. So please come forward.
Hello, my name is Lindsay Bass. I'm actually going to give a talk tomorrow on a somewhat related topic because most of the kids that I work with are in a K-12 space. And I was, looking at your slides and looking at your abstract in more detail, and I circled the boldface here. Hear what you compose and compose what you hear. And a lot of times when you're working with younger students, which I understand you do, and I appreciate that you do, I spend a lot of time trying to get them to kind of cultivate hearing creatively. And I wanted to piggyback on, actually, I guess all three of the questions, but I was listening to the first question, first person, and the second person's questions, and I wonder first how you explore just that very first stage with your younger students, so that I'll have that to think back on tomorrow morning. And then secondly, when you were talking about the listening that you do and those mid-century composers, do you have a listening curriculum for your students? Because I often will respond to what my students are giving me. And I'll respond with a recommendation. And I wonder if you, just trying to get them to hear creatively and then develop some intention with it, I wonder if you have already worked that problem.
Yes, yeah, that's great. Fantastic question. First of all, to address your first question about hearing and about listening, I like to do that through fun and non-conventional approaches to the instruments. I think they really enjoy it, and kids love new music. They're curious about it, and I think we hold it sort of cloistered in a way that doesn't allow them to explore that world. So I think, playing inside the piano, maybe just as an exercise to create a sound.
Oh yeah, you
is
take a piano
something.
apart, it blows their mind.
Yeah, exactly. So I think that can be a great tool. In terms of a listening curriculum, I have a list of hundreds of pieces for different problems. There's certainly, I have a syllabus for orchestration that I teach both on the undergraduate and the graduate level. And you could pretty much teach all of orchestration through Debussy's La Mer, in various different assignments. So yes, I do have a catalog, but I don't, I guess I don't use it in a predictable way. It really depends from student to student on what we're working on. There's composers, there's techniques, there's different tools you can learn from different composers. I have a file cabinet filled with marked up scores and pieces that I've analyzed, and that's my catalog primarily for teaching. But I don't put it down in any sort of formulaic way. It really, I get the student, particularly we're talking about university level students, to ask that question or to pose that problem, and then I come with an appropriate example of that.
Thank you so much for joining us today, Mara. It's great to have you with us remotely. We wish you could be here in person. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much.